Hey, Shalom, Akim, Shalom, Shalom. All praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh, Ba'ashem, Yahweh Shai, Ba'ashem, Lakakwadash. Double honors to the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone for teaching us his truth, and salutations to the sincere Akim and Akwath and listen. May the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Brother Raquai. I'm back in here with another quick and Lord's will, as always, an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, I kind of wanted to talk about lowly men and how vocabulary is essentially not a marker of intelligence. That was something we briefly spoke about, during the camp on Saturday. But I kind of wanted to add a little bit more to it, right? And kind of go into the word vocabulary and, how ratazah, how willing that this lesson may be edifying, right? Because one of the things people think that is that vocabulary, especially our people, when they hear, big words, somebody who's very, very an extensive, has a lot of, words in their mental Rolodex, so to speak, they think and attribute it to someone who is quote unquote intelligent, someone who has a lot of wisdom, so to speak, right? And we know, pursuant to the scriptures, that wisdom is the essentially what you get when fear is applied, right? When you have when you fear the Lord, that is really just the first step or the beginning of acquiring wisdom, right? And we know a lot of these people in the world are not wise. Why? Because they don't have a fear of Yahweh Bashem Shai, right? As a matter of fact, let me start off with that first, and then what I'll do is I'll get the word vocabulary. Just bear with me. Proverbs. Okay, this is Proverbs chapter 9, verse 10. And it says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the holy is understanding," right? So that's really the beginning of wisdom, right? A lot of our people, because they think when they attend a lot of these different schools, they might, and they even also when they listen to certain people, because they have an extensive memory bank with different words that they may not have heard before. They're very good. They're very, excuse me, a very good wordsmith. They think and attribute that to essentially having, wisdom, knowledge, and understanding, right? But it just means that the person is just a very good, speaker. They're more of an eloquent speaker. And the men of the Lord, right? And this is something the Apostle Paul talked about as well. The men of the Lord are not going to have, quote unquote, they're not going to be very, very eloquent, so to speak, in speech. They're not going to be rude in knowledge, but they're not going to be they're going to be a bit like essentially rough around the edges. They're going to be lowly men. They're not going to be people who are wearing fancy suit and ties. They're not going to be people who are wearing completely decked out, they're going to be very, very lowly, right? I mentioned a couple things. Let me go to First Corinthians. Actually, I'll go to 2 Corinthians 11. Okay, this is 2 Corinthians 11 verse 6. I'll read it in the AMP here, and it says, "But even if I am unskilled in speaking," this is the Apostle Paul speaking, "yet I am not untrained in knowledge. I know what I'm talking about, but we have made this evident to you in every way in all things." In the KJV it says, "But though I be rude in speech," right? So the men of the Lord, they're going to come off in a very a particular way, right? And they're going to say things in a particular way. They may not have all the words, so to speak, but essentially what would happen is when they speak, is they're speaking essentially to the law and the testimony. That shows that there's light in them, right? We don't speak according to our own understanding. We don't lean upon our own understanding, so to speak, right? But a lot of these people, especially a lot of our people, are very, very easily deceived because they think having a large vocabulary, means it's a mark of intelligence, right? So I'm kind of pretty much trying to hit two main points at once. Just bear with me. So let me go to the word vocabulary since I mentioned that here. Just bear with me. Okay, vocabulary in the etymology online, and it says a list with brief definitions or explanation of words. It says a list of words, word, name, noun. So it comes from vocare, meaning to name or call. I believe that's where you get the word vocation, if I'm not mistaken. So essentially, it's someone who has. Hold on. There's a little bit more. It says meaning, range of words in the language of a person or group. Sum of words in a language, right? So someone can have a lot of words in their language. And Esau is very good at this too. He's a very good wordsmith. He has a lot of words in his language. Somebody who might have a lot of words in their in a particular language, like for example, what's this guy's name? Malcolm X. When he spoke with a certain level of eloquence. He spoke, with and a lot of the words he used, you may not, a lot of our people, a lot of those words will go over our people's heads because they think this man is speaking a lot of truth, right? A lot of some truths that we're speaking, he probably was speaking, but a guy like that, he's into Islam, right? That's deceiving our people, right? But it shows you the difference between somebody who speaks very well, right, and someone who actually speaking according to the Lord's word, right? So the men of the Lord, they're not going to be people that are essentially very very, very eloquent, so to speak. Someone who's eloquent is somebody who's like, when you think about Malcolm X and you watch his speeches, somebody like Martin Luther King, when you look at the way he speaks, they speak with a certain level of fluidity, right? But most of us, when we speak, we speak with a stammer, right? We don't speak, essentially, it doesn't come out as smoothly as it's supposed to, right? Most of us didn't attend colleges and universities, so to speak. Some of us did, and if I'm being honest, you don't really learn too much when you go to all of these institutions, right? You're better off knowing and having a trade. That's just my opinion. But it shows you that you go to these colleges and universities, and this is what people acquire. A lot of our people acquire, and they think that equates to knowledge, wisdom, understanding. They think that equates to intelligence, right? The scriptures talk about how why go and spend money for which is not bread, and your labor that satisfieth not, because you go into these institutions thinking that you're going to get something of substance, and you don't actually get an understanding of your heritage, your culture, the fear of the Lord. Like, those things aren't taught in schools and in colleges and universities, right? You get a lot of essentially serpent's philosophies in these different schools. So let's hit a couple precepts. Because I mentioned the point about lowliness, just the way the Lord chooses. This is 1 Corinthians 1 verse 26, and it says, "For ye see your calling, brethren, how not many wise men after the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called, but the Most High hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. The Most High Yahweh hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty," right? And the prophets are examples of things that are, quote unquote, in the flesh weak, right? we don't have any, army. We don't have any, we don't have any, quote unquote weapons. Well, we do have a weapon, but the weapon really is spiritual, right? Because it's sharper than any two-edged sword, right? That's what makes us powerful, right? With the words that we're speaking out of our mouth are like pursuant to Jeremiah are coming out as fire, right? And it makes the people, and it cuts them, piercing their hearts and piercing them, right? Because it triggers a reaction out of these people, right? Because it's truth. All right, it's breaking, like the scriptures say, it breaks down strongholds, right? Strongholds, like when I was talking about the philosophies of this world, that's one of the things the truth, breaks down. Like, for example, I'll give you an example. One of the things that's very common in these institutions like college and universities is ranking your IQ. And I was just looking this up like an hour ago, and IQ, it goes back to this German, so-called Jewish German scientist name. I believe his name was, let me just look it up real quick. I think his name was William Stern. Let me just make sure. Let me just double check that real quick. Hold on. William Stern. Okay, here. Okay, let me just read this real quick. So Stern coined the term intelligence quotient and invented the tone variator as a new way to study human perception. Stern studied psychology and philosophy under Hermann Ebbinghaus at University of Berlin, and quickly moved on to teach at the University of Breslau. Right, so he came up with this understanding of intelligence quotient, right? And these are just all these different tests that Esau comes up with. He comes up with his own version, so to speak, of having intelligence and understanding, right? It's not coming from Yahweh Bashim Yahushai, right? Because the wicked, because their soul is not upright, they're the Most High. They don't have the Most High in their thoughts, right? And really and truly, all intelligence really comes from Yahweh Bashim Yahushai, right? And these people are wicked. So let me go to hold on. Okay, this is Wisdom of Solomon 7 verse 17, and it says, "For he hath given me certain knowledge of the things that are, namely to know how the world was made, and the operation of the elements, the circuits of years, and the position of stars, the nature of living creatures, the furies of wild beasts, the violence of winds, the reasonings of men, the diversities of plants, and the virtues of roots, and all such things are as either secret or manifest, them I know." So all these things, are made known unto us, because the scriptures say that surely the Lord will reveal nothing unto his secrets unto his servants, the prophets, to roughly paraphrase, right? So we get an understanding of all these different things, right? And it changes the way you think about a lot of things that you see around you. It changes, and it gives you an understanding of how things, we see the way, like, for example, we see the wickedness that is upon the planet Earth, and then we understand that there is a way of how things should be run. Like, for example, case in point, we understand that people should not eat shellfish, because we know pursuing going back to the law, statutes, and commandments, which gives us an insight of how Yahweh Bashim Shai intends the Israelite man to actually govern the earth. It gives you an understanding of like, okay, this is not meant to be eaten. So we're going to leave this in the ocean and let it do what it's supposed to do. We're going to leave these animals in the ocean so they can clean up the ocean. We're going to leave these birds and we're not going to eat them. I'm going to let them do their cleanup crew. We're going to leave the vultures do what they do, so they can get rid of all the dead carcasses and so on and so forth, right? But Esau, being so proud, he thinks that he has the understanding of how the world should be run, and then we see the results thereof. An unwise king, he destroys he destroys the people, right? And a lot of our people subscribe to his understanding. For example, when they go into these colleges and universities, they think that they're gonna get the pinnacle of understanding by attending these, especially Ivy League schools. Like, you think about Harvard and Yale and what's another one? Like here in Canada, you have Western University, you have UFT, and so on and so forth, right? When our people think that they go into these colleges and universities, it makes them, intelligent, so to speak. Like, no, there's a difference. If somebody can have a very large mental Rolodex of words, but it doesn't make them intelligent, because one, they are not privy to having an understanding of how to actually serve the Lord, and they don't have a healthy fear of Yahweh Bashim Shai, because that there's a way to run things on the earth, right? When the Lord breathed into Adam, that breath, and gave him that understanding, then that's the understanding that he had to be able to maintain the land, like what the scriptures say, to dress it and to keep it, right? That's an understanding that that we have, like, okay, this is the way we're supposed to maintain the land. It just all comes down to decency and order, right? But Esau is a degenerate individual, so he just does what he wants, and our people follow after that and think that he is a god. They think he is a what's the word I'm looking for? They think he is wise, right? They think of these guys like Elon Musk and Donald Trump and these kind of characters to be wise people, but these are just they're just servants that are just walking up on horses, right? They're not wise people. They're very unintelligent, so to speak, right? And there's nothing wrong with being lowly, right? Let me go to Matthew. I'm kind of a bit all over the place, but I pray that this lesson is edifying. Let me go to Matthew. Okay, this is Matthew chapter 4, verse 18, and it says, "And Yahushua, walking by the Sea of Galilee, saw two brethren, Simon called Peter, and Andrew his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishers. And he said unto them," Yahushua speaking, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. And they straightway left their nets and followed him." Right. So, I was just reading this as an example, because, the Lord really chooses and he deals with, like lowly men. He's not dealing with, he doesn't choose the Jay-Z's and the Kendrick Lamars, and that's not where you're going to find, quote unquote wisdom. Right. And that's another thing of how, the Lord, sees us also, if you really think of it, because a lot of us are not, we're kind of seen as the offscouring. We're not seen as, because we have that roughness around the edges. We stammer when we speak. We might have a speech impediment. We're not, very, what's the word I'm looking for? What's the word I'm looking for? We're very, we might crack a joke, to kind of solidify a point. Sometimes we stammer on different words. It doesn't come out as eloquent as, as a quote unquote should. That's just the way the Lord chooses. We're dressed in sackcloth. We're not looking. We don't look decked out, but we're decked out in the spirit. We're decked out in the mind, and that's what makes our. That's why a lot of our people stumble, because they think that the men of the Lord are going to be these. They're gonna look kind of clean cut, like like Superman, they're gonna look like those kind of people, right? We don't come in that fashion. Paul says we don't talks about, when I came to you, it's not with excellency of speech, right? But that's just the way the Lord chooses, right? First Samuel. 1 Samuel 16:7, and it says, "But the Lord said unto Samuel, Look not on his countenance, nor on the height of his stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord seeth not as man seeth, for man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart," right? Just to solidify the point about the way the Lord chooses, right? And this is going into when King David. Well, he wasn't king at the time as of yet, but he was, he was to become the next king, right? Eventually he became anointed, and Saul, put hell upon him, and eventually he becomes king. But that's just the way the Lord chooses, right? Because I believe there were about 7 sons, if I'm not mistaken, right? And then eventually there was like one more, right? And then it was David. He was the next one, right? He was the next runner up, right? He didn't look the part, so to speak. And that's kind of like how we are also, because we don't look the part in terms of, we're not well seen in high regard in this world. We're seen very, very lowly, very meek, very humble, but just to show, the lowly men, that's where you would find wisdom, right? But a lot of our people despise that, because a lot of our people despise the poor man, as the scriptures say that the poor man's wisdom is despised, right? So that's pretty much let me get this one in Acts. Actually, I wanted to just to drive that last point home. And it says, Acts 4 verse 13, and it says, "And now when they saw the boldness of Peter and John, and perceived that they were unlearned and ignorant men, they marveled, and they took knowledge of them that they had been with Yahushua. And beholding the man that was healed standing with them, they could not say nothing. They could say nothing against it," right? So they looked like people who were unlearned and ignorant, right? And that's kind of like how a lot of our people look at us. It's the same mindset, right? Nothing new, nothing new under the sun, right? This is because of our outward appearance, and a lot of us, have those kind of like, regular jobs, you work with your hands, nothing wrong with that. You do what you got to do for your daily bread, right? But anyways, that's pretty much the point, in regards to vocabulary and intelligence, right? It's not a true marker of intelligence, right? Someone who is intelligent, first and foremost, has a healthy fear of Yahweh Bashim Shai, right? It's not it's just someone who has a large vocabulary to sum up everything, has just has a lot of words available in their mental Rolodex, right? It doesn't mean that they're intelligent, it doesn't mean anything, but I just gotta just bring out these couple points here. But Lord's will, this lesson was edifying. Just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashim Yahushai. Until next time, I say Shalom.